happy to be here. And as you can see, my presentation is going to be about nitrogen pollution in Long Island's coastal waters, crisis, and opportunity. And I don't think we can overstate the importance of water for Long Island. We're surrounded by water, and the water that we drink comes from beneath our feet. So it's of the utmost importance. Just to emphasize that second point, underneath Long Island, for those people who don't know, sits a series of aquifers, and that's where all of our drinking water comes from, throughout all of Nassau County, all of Suffolk County. So essentially, if we want to have clean water, we got to take care of what's happening on land and how that's affecting what's below our feet. Beyond drinking water, we all know how important our coastal waters are to all Long Islanders. For example, we know how beautiful the ecosystems are of our coastal waters, and that draws and attracts people to our shorelines. In Suffolk County, for example, recreational boating and recreational fishing represent billion-dollar industries, as does tourism. And with regards to fishing, of course, there's a long and great history of fisheries on Long Island. Today, beyond the recreational fisheries being worth $1 billion, our commercial fisheries, again, Suffolk County alone is worth $1 billion. And again, this continues a great history that we've had here on Long Island when it comes to our maritime culture and fisheries. Going back centuries ago, we know how important whaling and menhaden, today known as bunker, were as key fisheries right here in Long Island, economic drivers. That continued through the 20th century as the oyster fishery, which was the largest fishery in the whole world, located right here in New York and also here in Long Island. And then through the 20th century, the importance of clamming. We all know that 2 out of every 3 hard clams eaten on the east coast of the U.S. came out of Great South Bay right through the end of the 20th century. But things are beginning to change. Things are looking different today. So, for example, the end of the 20th century saw the collapse of the 2 largest and most important fisheries here on Long Island, the hard clam and the bay scallop, that went from being tremendous drivers of employment, economic industry, to being only at 1% of their peak landings by the end of the 20th century. But we don't even need to look at fisheries landings to understand that our waters are changing. And we just need to look back to what happened in 2015. So, for example, as a cold winter and spring began to transition to summer, we had an unprecedented event in Riverhead where we had hundreds of diamondback terrapin turtles washing up dead across Flanders Bay, ultimately linked to red tide that we know is caused by excessive nitrogen. Only weeks later, hundreds of thousands of menhaden, again known as bunker, began washing up on the shores of Flanders Bay and the Peconic River, this being associated with, again, excessive nitrogen loading, low oxygen, and algal blooms. The following month, we had a brown tide that started in Peconic Bay and then actually spread all throughout Long Island on the South Shore. So ultimately up to 100 kilometers of our South Shore through Great South Bay, Moriches Bay, Peconic Bay, covered with brown tide that we know is stimulated by nitrogen and also we know kills our shellfish. In Nassau County at about the same time, we had the overgrowth of sea lettuce and ulva that was washing up on our beaches. And then finally, going into the fall, we had something known as a rust tide showing up on the eastern end of Long Island. And this rust tide, not only does it look horrendous, but it is highly toxic to both fish and shellfish. So what's going on? Why is this the case? Well, it all goes back to water and the fact that here on Long Island, every parcel of land is within what we'd call a watershed. So whether you live on the east end, in Nassau County, the North Shore, the South Shore, all of Long Island is a watershed, and therefore any water that falls to the land ultimately is going through our feet and into our aquifer, so it's something we're going to drink, and then importantly, it's then discharging to our coastal waters and affecting what's happening in there. And so, as we take Suffolk County as an example, we saw Suffolk County's population grow by an order of magnitude through the 20th century, now having more than 1.5 million people, just about matching what we have in Nassau County. And along with that rapid population growth, we've seen in the groundwater the levels of nitrogen steadily rising, and rising to a point that maybe is not a human health threat right now, but is a serious threat to our coastal ecosystems. And that's why the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation has declared almost all of Long Island's water bodies impaired. And those that aren't impaired have already been cited for what they call minor impacts and may be impaired in the future. So to transition now and talk about some examples, I'm going to start by talking about salt marshes. These are critical marine ecosystems that support our fisheries, both finfish and shellfish, but we also know they're really important for migratory birds and even terrestrial mammals. What's underappreciated is their very important role in protecting our shorelines. We learned this during Hurricane Sandy, where we found that communities that had intact salt marshes fared far better than those that were built right up to the shoreline. And now it's well recognized by the DEC that we must have strong salt marshes to protect us from future storms. And so as we look at the south shore of, say, Nassau County, you can see all of the salt marshes there. Those are really, really important for protecting us against flooding. And now what's interesting is if we look at what happened during Hurricane Sandy, I'm showing you a map here of the flooding of Long Island. Almost 10% of Long Island was flooded during Hurricane Sandy. And you can see where the highly focused area was, right in that area where a salt marsh is. And I'm showing you there in some places over 15 feet of storm surge. And that's with the salt marshes intact. But what we've learned about salt marshes and nitrogen since that point in time is how sensitive they can be to excessive nitrogen. When you have excessive nitrogen going into our salt marshes, what that can essentially do is weaken them. It makes their roots weak and not as strong as you see in a pristine salt marsh. And when that happens, and you get the overgrowth of the vegetation above the salt marsh, they begin to collapse, as is shown in this picture right there. And so we now know that these salt marshes are highly vulnerable to excessive nitrogen loading. And is at least one of the reasons that if you go across Long Island, be it the North Shore, the South Shore, the East End, all of these regions have had significant losses in salt marshes since the end of the 20th century. And so when we look back to Hurricane Sandy, yes, there was terrible flooding, but it could be much worse in the future if we continue to lose salt marshes because of excessive nitrogen loading. Another marine habitat that's important to mention are seagrasses. These ecosystems are so important for our fisheries. We do work on the eastern end of Long Island in Peconic Bay and find that more than 90% of the fish that we pull up in our experimental trawls are found within seagrasses. And that's no surprise because these are known as nursery habitats. Small fish and shellfish will go in there to protect themselves. But again, the trends on salt marshes, on seagrasses are equally disturbing. And that is, we've lost 90% of our seagrasses since the 20th century, with only a small amount left and some predictions that we might lose it all going forward. And that's because these seagrass meadows and habitats are highly sensitive to excessive nitrogen loading. And just to put it in an economic perspective, we now know an acre of seagrass is worth about $1,000. So if you add up what we've lost since the end of the 20th century, we've left about $10 billion in fisheries on the table that we could have had if our salt marshes had stayed intact. Our seagrasses had stayed intact. I showed in my introduction to the presentation some water being discolored, either red or brown, and these are what are known as harmful algal blooms. Unfortunately, here on Long Island, we have more than 6 different classes of harmful algal blooms to be concerned about. If you went back to about 1980, when our fisheries were doing so well, we didn't have any of these going on. But since that point in time, starting in 1985, they've shown up in progression, and there's 2 classes that are both troubling. The class that I'm showing here on the left are toxic algal blooms. That is, these microalgae make a toxin that is poisonous to human, a neurotoxin or a gastrointestinal toxin. And people can be affected by eating shellfish. Dogs can also be affected by drinking, for example, lake water that has high levels of these toxins. Alternatively, we have a second class of harmful algal blooms. They're not toxic to humans, but as I mentioned in my intro, they can kill fish and kill shellfish, and they've been responsible for the collapse of some of our fisheries. And there's been a lot of research on these harmful algal blooms, both here in New York, but also around the world. And we now know that these harmful algal blooms become more intense and more toxic from excessive nitrogen loading. So as the levels of nitrogen have increased in our coastal waters, these blooms have become more intense. And just to hone in on one of these harmful algal blooms that is maybe the most disturbing, It's known as Alexandrium. It makes a toxin called saxitoxin and leads to paralytic shellfish poisoning. Again, something we never had in New York before 2006, and now has become an annual event. And if you look at this slide here, and specifically look at that molecule, now I don't expect anyone here or listening to be a chemist, but if you look at the molecule saxitoxin, what you'll notice is that it's loaded with nitrogen atoms. In fact, more than 7, up to 10 in some versions of this toxin. So essentially what that means is if you give this organism enough nitrogen, or even excessive nitrogen, it's going to make more toxins. And it runs in reverse. Reduce the nitrogen levels, the toxin levels go down. But we have published research right here in Long Island that has shown that these toxic algal blooms that are a threat to human health become more intense and more toxic when you have high levels of nitrogen entering our coastal waters. We specifically, for example, in Northport showed that it was due to wastewater, likely from a sewage treatment plant. But it's not just a Northport issue. If you look across Long Island, this organism is widespread. And this map here, anywhere in red is an area where we found during the past decade or so more than 1,000 cells per liter. That's a level that's high enough to make shellfish toxic. And if you see an area that's not red but green or yellow, that's an area where if we have more nitrogen, these blooms could become more intense. And so we look all across Long Island, we see these algal blooms are very widespread. Another issue that I won't get into detail on is low oxygen, which is also a consequence of excessive nitrogen loading. But be it low oxygen, harmful algal blooms, loss of habitat, shell fisheries on Long Island, which have historically always been the top fisheries in New York State, have been collapsing. So whether it's mussels, clams, oysters, scallops, landings are down somewhere between 70 and 90% since the year 1980. And again, we know this is related to nitrogen. So where's all that nitrogen coming from? Well, that science has been done. There used to be a lot of speculation. People could say, oh, well, it's the runoff, which is a sort of a nebulous phrase. But there have been scientific studies during the past several years, and we know that the answer is wastewater. And in Suffolk County, that is mainly coming from cesspools and septic tanks. But just to give you an example, here's a study that was done for Great South Bay, where they looked at whether the nitrogen's coming from fertilizer, or from the atmosphere, or from septic tanks and cesspools. And the answer is wastewater from septic tank and cesspools. But you can go around Long Island. Here's a study that I was involved in, Mauritius and Peconic Bay. Just about the same answer. The East End. Well, the percentage from wastewater isn't as high, but still, for the Peconic estuary in the East End, the largest source of nitrogen is cesspools and septic tanks. And even on the North Shore, in some regions that have sewers around them, areas that don't, the biggest source of nitrogen are from cesspools and septic tanks. And this is a real issue in Suffolk County, where there's more than 360,000 homes that are not connected to sewage treatment plants, but rather are connected to cesspools and septic tanks that are leaching their nitrogen into our groundwater. And this is more than the total number for all of New Jersey, and the next closest county in New York State has about 50,000. So this is a big problem. So on occasion I make trips to China to work with Chinese scientists who are struggling with some of the same issues. And from those discussions, I've learned a little Chinese. Not really, just a little maybe. And I can tell you that the Chinese characters for crisis are actually broken up into two. One meaning danger, and there's clearly some danger to human health in our marine ecosystems, but the other representing opportunity. And I think there's now a building momentum of people recognizing what the problem is and potentially what some of the solutions are. So just to give a final avenue to talk about here, I'll mention that at Stony Brook University we have a new center called the Center for Clean Water Technology that's focused on these cesspools and septic tanks. And as I mentioned before, as currently constructed, these homes with cesspools and septic tanks have what are known as leaching pools. The water either goes from the wastewater goes from the home to a septic tank and then either into a leaching pool or just goes directly to a cesspool. But either way, these devices were designed decades ago. This is early 20th century technology, and they're specifically designed to allow nitrogen to be removed from these cesspools and septic tanks and to enter our groundwater. And they're doing that quite well, as we can see. So the Center for Clean Water Technology is focused on coming up on 21st century technology to come up with these systems that remove more nitrogen, that are a smaller footprint, and I'll show you some examples of some alternative systems, and that are less expensive and also maybe easier to operate. And so again, hopefully don't need a chemistry degree to understand that nitrogen is complex. It goes through something called the nitrogen cycle, but there's this wonderful reaction called denitrification that can turn the nitrogen that's into a septic tank into nitrogen gas. And if you don't know, nitrogen gas is 80% of our atmosphere. And so if we can do that, it becomes something that's doing lots of harm to something that would be virtually harmless. So we want to capture the technology to do a better job of that. There are systems that already do that. We want to focus on making them even more efficient and having particular approaches that are ideal for Long Island. Because we believe that if we can do that, we can transition our estuaries and ecosystems from what they look like now back to what we want with thriving fisheries. So I'll conclude by saying water really is at the heart of the Long Island existence, and that the current excessive nitrogen loading that we have is doing harm to our ecosystems and harm to our economy. And so we need to come up with plans and technologies to reduce these nitrogen levels to benefit everyone.